My son called me on a Thursday evening not long ago, and the first thing he said was, "Dad, I heard you're saying God had a wife." He wasn't yelling. He wasn't angry. He spoke in a low voice, the kind of voice you use when you're standing somewhere and you don't want the person in the next room to hear you. And that, more than anything else, is what I remember about the call, the careful quietness of it. He's a grown man in his 40s. He has kids of his own. He goes to church most Sundays. And he was talking to me the way you talk to someone standing too close to the edge of something dangerous. I tried to explain. He listened. He was polite about it. But then he said the thing I haven't been able to stop thinking about since. He said, "I can't go there with you, Dad." Not, "I disagree," just, "I cannot go there." We talked for another minute about his kids, and then he hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand, looking at the window, at the last of the light going out of the trees in the backyard, thinking about all the places a man goes alone in his later years. His wife is gone. Some of his friends from the church stopped calling, and now his son can hear his voice, but cannot follow him into the room where the evidence lives. That is the cost of looking directly at what the texts say. And I want to be clear before we go any further. I am not here to be provocative. I am here because something happened in the sands of the Sinai desert in 1975 that confirmed what a philosopher in Amsterdam had concluded 300 years earlier from nothing but his own reading of the Hebrew text. The evidence is real and specific, and it has been sitting in academic journals and biblical footnotes for 50 years, while most people who fill a pew on Sunday morning have never heard a word of it. The God you were taught about, singular, alone, without partner, without consort, the one God of strict monotheism who had always been that way since the beginning, that God is not what the oldest evidence shows. And the man who first proved it from the text alone, 3 centuries before anyone dug up the proof, was Baruch Spinoza. In 1670, Baruch Spinoza published a book that almost no one dared to put their name on. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus arrived with a false publisher listed on the cover, the false city of publication, and no author's name. Not because Spinoza was timid, because he was practical. He knew what happened to men who published ideas like his. He had watched it happen to friends. He was 38 years old, living in a rented room in The Hague, grinding lenses during the day and writing at night by candlelight. He published this book with a fake name on the cover and waited for the world to catch up. That tells you something about the man. That also tells you something about what was in the book. In chapter 17 of the Tractatus, Spinoza did something no one in the European religious establishment was supposed to do. He read the Hebrew Bible as a historian would read any other ancient document. Not as received revelation, not as the word of God dropped complete and perfect from heaven, as a text produced by human beings in specific historical circumstances, over a long period of time, with the seams showing if you looked carefully enough. And when he looked at the oldest layers of the text, what he saw was not the strict monotheism the church and the synagogue had been teaching for centuries. Open the book of Exodus, chapter 15, verse 11. This is the Song of Moses, one of the oldest passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. After the crossing of the Red Sea, Moses and the Israelites sing, "Who is like you among the gods, YHWH?" Not, "There are no other gods." Not, "You alone exist." The verse asks, "Who compares to you among the gods?" It places one in a field of divine beings and asserts his superiority among them. It does not deny the existence of the others. Spinoza noticed this. He noticed that the Hebrew word Elohim, usually translated simply as God, is grammatically plural. He noticed that the text contains conversations in which God speaks in the first person plural. "Let us make man in our image." He noticed that the patriarchs used El Elyon, the Most High God, as a distinct name, separate from YHWH, as if they were 2 different beings. He noticed Psalm 82, verse 1. God takes his stand in the divine assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. There is an assembly. There are multiple gods in it. YHWH is presiding over them. This is not the theology of one God alone in the universe. This is the theology of a divine council, with YHWH as its most powerful member. And then Spinoza asked the question that changed everything. How did we get from that, From a religious tradition that acknowledged a divine world populated by multiple beings, to the strict, total, absolute monotheism that the tradition claims was always there from the beginning. He concluded in 1670 that the answer was editorial, that scribes and priests working at a specific moment in Israel's history had imposed the strict reading onto texts that originally said something else, that the God of Abraham had been lonely by bureaucratic decision, not by original revelation. He had no inscriptions. He had no scroll fragments. He had not walked into any desert and found any jar. He had only the text in Hebrew, read slowly and honestly in a rented room while his city argued about politics and his neighbors argued about God. And what he found there, the traces of something older underneath the official theology, the divine council language left in plain sight because the editors had not caught every instance, was so clear to him that he published it with a fake name on the cover and waited. The world took 300 years, but it caught up. In 1947, a Bedouin teenager named Muhammad al-Din was searching for a lost goat in the cliffs above the Dead Sea near a place called Qumran, when his stone hit something hollow inside a cave. Inside were clay jars. Inside the jars were scrolls wrapped in linen. He didn't know what they were. He sold them, scholars bought them, and over the following decade, a team of archaeologists excavated 11 caves at Qumran and extracted what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls, roughly 900 documents, some nearly complete, some fragmentary, the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible ever found. They were written between approximately 150 BCE and 68 CE, roughly 1,000 years older than the manuscripts that had previously been the basis for every translation of the Hebrew Bible in the world. And when scholars compared the Dead Sea Scrolls to the standard Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, the version all modern Bibles are translated from, they found something that most people in the pews have still never been told. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8. In the Masoretic text, the version you'll find in almost every English Bible, the verse reads, "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel." That's what your Bible says. The nations of the world were distributed in a way that corresponds numerically to the tribes of Israel. Now read what the Dead Sea Scroll says. Specifically, the scroll fragment scholars label 4Q Deut, discovered in Cave 4 at Qumran. The same verse, same passage, but the crucial phrase reads differently. It says, according to the number of the sons of God. The sons of God, Bene Elohim in Hebrew, these are not the same thing. The Dead Sea Scroll version gives you something else entirely, a theological structure in which El Elyon, the Most High God, distributed the nations of the world among the members of a divine council, with each member receiving one nation to oversee. And YHWH received Israel, not as the supreme deity above all creation, as one of the sons of God who was assigned a portion. Michael Heiser, a biblical scholar who spent his career studying the divine council theology in the Hebrew Bible, is an evangelical Christian, not a skeptic, not someone looking to dismantle anyone's faith. And even he confirms it plainly. The original text of Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 understood YHWH as one divine being among many in a council presided over by El Elyon. A scribal change, deliberate and targeted, replaced sons of God with sons of Israel, to remove the implication that YHWH was anything other than the sole supreme deity. Someone sat in a room, probably during the period of the Second Temple, and changed two words. Not because the old words were damaged or unclear, because the old words said something the new theology could not tolerate. The scribe simply wrote, "Sons of Israel," where the text had said "Sons of God," closed the scroll and walked out. And for nearly 2,000 years, that version became the Bible. The original sat in a sealed jar in a cave above the Dead Sea and waited for a Bedouin boy to throw a stone. Spinoza said the strict monotheism was a late editorial imposition. He said it in 1670, with nothing but the text in his hands. The Dead Sea Scrolls arrived in 1947, 277 years later, with the altered text and the original side by side, proving him right. Now stay with me, because we haven't even gotten to the stone yet. You have to understand who Asherah was before the reformers got to work on her. In the ancient Near East, El was the father of the gods, the head of the divine assembly, the gray-bearded patriarch who presided over the council of heaven. And Asherah was his consort, his wife, the mother of the divine family. The texts from Ugarit, a Bronze Age city discovered in 1929 in what is now Syria, give us her full portrait. She walks on the sea, she nurses kings, she intercedes with El on behalf of the divine beings below her. She is not marginal, she is central. When the ancestors of the Israelites settled in Canaan, she was already there, already established, already receiving prayers from the people who farmed those hills. She was part of the religious landscape the way the hills themselves were part of the landscape. And she remained because the people who became Israel brought their need for a mother in the divine order with them. And that need did not disappear because a priest declared it sinful. The remarkable thing is how many times the Bible mentions her, not just in passing, with obsessive alarm. The word Asherah poles, or sacred groves, appears more than 40 times in the Old Testament, almost always in condemnation. Destroy the Asherah poles, cut down the sacred groves. Kings and prophets repeat it like a drumbeat that never stops. And here is what the drumbeat tells you. You do not command people to destroy something 40 times unless 40 times those people have rebuilt it. The persistence of Asherah in the text is the persistence of a belief that grew in the same soil as the faith that condemned it. But the most explosive evidence is not in the condemnations. It is in one verse, 2 Kings chapter 21 verse 7. Manasseh was king of Judah for 55 years, described as the most wicked king in Israel's history. And what made him so wicked? Among other things, he placed the carved image of Asherah that he had made inside the temple. Not in the hills, not in pagan Samaria, inside the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, the place where the high priest entered the Holy of Holies once a year, the most sacred space in Israelite religion. The text does not say the installation shocked anyone. It does not say the priests refused. It says he installed it, which means the temple personnel did not immediately tear it down, which means a carved image of Asherah inside the house of YHWH was, at minimum, something that could exist without causing a riot. The God of strict solitary monotheism does not have a wife's image standing in his temple for years, unless the people who maintained that temple did not actually believe in strict solitary monotheism. Unless they believed in something older, something that had survived from before the official theology hardened, and that even now, carved in sacred wood and placed in the most sacred space in the world, refused to disappear. Now let me take you to a desert in the Sinai. Not a metaphor, a specific place. In 1975, an Israeli archaeologist named Ze'ev Meshel led an excavation team to a site called Kuntilet Ajrud, a remote location in the northeastern Sinai, near an ancient crossroads where desert trade routes had once converged. What Meshel found there was the remains of a small building dating to approximately the 9th century BCE, during the period of the divided monarchy. Inside the ruins, the excavation team found 2 large ceramic storage jars. They were broken, as ancient pottery tends to be, but the inscriptions on them were intact. These were not official inscriptions, not royal proclamations, not temple dedications overseen by a committee of priests. They were the kind of informal writing that shows up on pottery when literate people are passing through and want to leave something behind. Blessings, dedications, sometimes just names. On one jar, the inscription reads, "I bless you by YHWH of Taman and his Asherah." On the second jar, "I bless you by YHWH of Samaria and his Asherah." 2 jars, 2 inscriptions, the same pairing. YHWH, the God of Israel, and connected to him by a possessive pronoun, Asherah. Not the Asherah, not an Asherah. The Hebrew uses a pronominal suffix that means in plain English, his Asherah. The Asherah that belongs to YHWH, the way a wife belongs to a husband. The inscription does not say the goddess Asherah, who is worshipped separately somewhere else. It says YHWH Asherah. They belong together in these words. Now, I know some scholars argue that Asherah here might refer to a ritual object, a wooden pole associated with her cult, rather than the goddess herself. That debate exists. But there is a second inscription that closes it. About 35 miles northeast of Hebron, in a place called Kirbet el-Kom, archaeologists found an inscription carved directly into the wall of a tomb, a private tomb. a man named Uriah who identified as the rich. 8th century BCE, a generation or two after Kuntilat Ajrud. It reads, "Blessed be Uriah by YHWH, and from his enemies he was saved by YHWH, and by his Asherah." I want you to sit with that for a second. This is not royal theology, not a temple dedication. This is a man carving the names of the divine beings he trusted to protect him in death, the chisel in his hand, the stone wall of his own tomb. When a man stands at the threshold of whatever comes after life and reaches for the names he believes will carry him through, those names tell you what he actually believes, not what his king commanded, not what the priest declared orthodox, what he believed alone, with the dust falling from the chisel. He reached for YHWH, and he reached for his Asherah. William Dever, the American archaeologist who spent decades excavating sites in Israel and Jordan, a practicing Christian, not a secularist, has said plainly that the worship of Asherah alongside YHWH was not a fringe practice, not foreign contamination. It was the religion of ordinary Israel, the religion of the farmer and the trader, and the man who carved his own tomb and wanted to be remembered as someone YHWH and his Asherah had blessed. This was what normal Israelites believed. They scratched it into their pottery. They carved it into their walls. And someone at some point decided it had to go. In the 18th year of King Josiah's reign, that is 621 BCE, a high priest named Hilkiah went into the temple treasury and came out holding a scroll. He brought it to the royal scribe Shaphan, who brought it to the king. And when Josiah heard the words of the scroll, he tore his robes, the ancient gesture for grief so total it tears you open. He declared that the nation had been in violation of this scroll's covenant for generations, and he launched the most comprehensive religious reform in the history of the Israelite monarchy. 2 Kings chapters 22 and 23 describe what he dismantled. He removed the vessels made for Baal and Asherah from the temple and burned them outside the city. He brought out the Asherah from the temple itself and burned it at the Kidron Valley, ground it to dust, and scattered the dust on graves. He slaughtered the priests of the high places. He destroyed the altars Manasseh had built in the temple courts. And then this, in chapter 23, verse 7, he tore down the spaces in the temple where the women did weaving for Asherah. Women weaving fabric inside the temple of Jerusalem for Asherah. Feel the weight of that sentence. This was not a marginal cult that had crept through some back door. These women had an established practice, a dedicated space, a specific craft, inside the most sacred building in Israelite religion. They had a workshop. They had been doing this long enough to be organized, recognized, and sanctioned by the temple establishment. They were there, working, for the goddess who stood beside YHWH. Josiah destroyed all of it. Now ask the question Spinoza would ask. If one God alone had always been the original religion of Israel, why was there so much to destroy inside the temple itself? You do not slaughter priests and scatter ashes on graves to correct a minor deviation. You do that to dismantle a system that is working exactly as designed. Josiah did not restore something. He imposed something. He burned and killed and defiled his way to a new theology, then wrote the history to say it had always been true. The scroll Hilkiah found in the temple. Most biblical scholars, including conservative scholars with no interest in discrediting the Bible, believe it was a version of Deuteronomy, written or heavily edited to provide legal authority for exactly the reform Josiah was already planning. You do not find a scroll that justifies your agenda. You produce one. The crime is visible in the scale of the destruction. Let me bring you one more scholar. Not because she's the most famous on this topic, and she isn't, but because what she built over her career is the most complete picture of what actually existed before Josiah's bonfire. Margaret Barker is an independent biblical scholar, not attached to a major university, which means she has never had institutional reasons to soften what the evidence says. Her 1992 book, The Great Angel, makes an argument that is meticulous, and once you follow it, very difficult to unravel. Barker argues that the original religion of Israel, the religion before the Reform, had a structure that looked like this. At the top, El Elyon, the Most High God, the ancient one who presides over the divine assembly, The one who, in Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, as the Dead Sea Scroll preserves it, divided the nations among the sons of God. El Elyon and Asherah were paired, the Divine Father and the Divine Mother. Below them, as one of the sons of God, was YHWH. He was powerful, active, the one who brought Israel out of Egypt, the one who fought their battles. He was the God Israel prayed to. But he was not, in the original structure, the same being as El Elyon. He was one of El's sons, the national deity of a specific people, but not the solitary creator of the entire universe. Over centuries, YHWH absorbed El. The two divine figures merged. Their names and attributes were combined, and when the distinction between El and YHWH collapsed, there was no longer any room for Asherah, because she had been the consort of El. And if YHWH was now El, having a consort made YHWH polytheistic by definition. So she had to go. Not because she was foreign, not because she had always been an intruder, but because the theology changed, and the new theology had no place for her. Here is where I want to tell you something personal. I have a copy of the NIV Study Bible that I bought in a Christian bookstore in the early 90s. Worn cover, pages stiff from years of handling, my own notes in the margins from the years when I was a deacon. I have read that Bible hundreds of times, and somewhere in the notes for Deuteronomy chapter 32, in small print at the bottom of the page, there is a footnote for verse 8. One sentence. It says something to the effect that the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint read, "Sons of God" rather than "Sons of Israel." One sentence, small print, at the bottom of a page. I had read that footnote dozens of times without understanding what it was telling me. I had read past it the way you read past fine print on a contract when you already know what you're signing. But it was telling me the text had been changed. It was telling me the version I was reading was not the original. It was pointing, in one quiet sentence in small print, directly at the alteration Spinoza had deduced from the internal logic of the text alone. 320 years before I sat at my desk in Knoxville with my reading glasses on and finally understood what a footnote was saying. It was there. It was always there. It just needed someone to stop and hold it up to the light. Now let me bring all of it together, because I want you to feel the weight of the timeline. In 1670, Spinoza read the Hebrew text and concluded that the strict monotheism of the Israelite tradition was not the original theology. It was imposed editorially by a priestly class working at a specific moment in history. He noticed the divine council language in Psalm 82. He noticed YHWH being compared to other gods in Exodus 15, rather than denying their existence. He noticed the difference between El Elyon and YHWH in the oldest passages. Two names, two different beings, treated as distinct before the theology collapsed them into one. He published this conclusion with no name on it, in a book so dangerous that its author feared for his life. In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls emerged from caves above the Dead Sea, and in the scroll fragment labeled 4Q Deut, the original reading of Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 was sitting there, unchanged, exactly as it had been written before a scribe rewrote it, according to the number of the sons of God. 277 years after Spinoza said it had to have happened. In 1975, Z.F. Meshel dug up two large ceramic jars in the Sinai desert and found written on them, in plain Hebrew, the blessing invoking YHWH and his Asherah, 305 years after Spinoza published without his name. And at some point in the 8th century BCE, a man named Uriyahu carved the name of his divine protector into the wall of his own tomb. The tradition tried to erase Asherah from the record. Josiah burned what he could burn and killed who he could kill, and ground what remained to dust and scattered the dust on graves. The scribes changed sons of God to sons of Israel and hoped the original would not survive. The reformers rewrote the theology and called it a restoration, but you cannot burn stone, and you cannot rewrite what a man has already carved into rock. The jars of Kuntilat Ajrud still say what they say. The tomb of Uriyahu at Kirbet el-Kom still says what it says. The scroll fragment in Cave 4 at Qumran still says what it says. These things have survived everything that tried to bury them. The desert preserved the jars for nearly 3,000 years. The dry air of the cave preserved the scroll. The stone of the tomb has held the inscription for nearly 26 centuries. What the reformers could not erase was not paganism infiltrating a pure faith. It was the actual religion of ordinary Israelites, the religion of the woman weaving fabric for Asherah inside the temple, the religion of the man who brought a blessing to a traveler by invoking YHWH and his divine consort. The religion that lived in the villages and the family altars and the private prayers long after the official theology in Jerusalem had declared it heresy. Margaret Barker argues that the religion before the Reform had, at its center, not just power but relationship. El and Asherah, the Divine Father and the Divine Mother, and YHWH as one of their sons, elevated, active, the God of history, a family, a structure that resembled the structure of the world these ancient people actually lived in. When the Reform stripped away the mother and left one solitary God alone in the universe, something was lost that even the Reformers could not entirely name. They kept condemning the sacred groves. They kept sending men to tear down the poles, generation after generation, because the need that Asherah answered did not go away when they erased her name. What I feel when I sit with all of this is not anger. It is something closer to grief. Grief for the woman in the temple weaving cloth for a goddess she believed in, who was told by a king that she was a sinner for doing what her mother had done in the house they all shared with their God. Grief for the man Uriah who, carving the name of his divine protector into the wall of his own tomb, not a heretic, just a man who believed what his neighbors believed. Grief for the version of the divine that had a feminine face, that was not alone, that stood in relationship rather than in solitary dominion. Grief for what was buried under the new theology, not because it was necessarily true in some cosmic sense, but because it was true to the people who held it, and it was taken from them without their consent. Spinoza would call this the work of those who read into the text what they want to find and erase from it what they don't. He had the text, in Hebrew, and the willingness to read it without flinching. No jars, no scrolls, no inscribed tomb wall, just the text and honesty, and the courage to follow where the evidence led, even when it led somewhere that required a fake name on the cover of your book. The jars say what they say. The stone says what it says. What Spinoza read in Amsterdam in 1670, by candlelight in a rented room, the desert confirmed 3 centuries later. They cannot erase what is carved in stone. That's the truth of it.